As we move into the practice, we generally experience fluctuations in terms of the challenges that we experience and the ease, the joy that we experience. Sometimes there are great challenges, sometimes there's great ease, and both, of course, are important parts of this. This is an adventure, and adventures often have this character. Sometimes things are very challenging. It's difficult to move forward at all. Difficult sometimes even to survive. Other times it's very easy, pleasant, sometimes to the point of being boring. We have the example of the hero's journey. We have a sense of people who go on these adventures, leaving home, facing monsters, finding treasures, and finally coming to the purpose, the point of their journey. Now, as many of you know, this has been studied to a certain extent, and after those studies were done, became the basis of a very successful cinematic presentation called Star Wars. The fact that it resonates with us, that something like that resonates with us, that not only has it resonated with us through the centuries, but that it resonates with us even in terms of what we're willing to pay to see in the modern day, indicates that there's something very important to us here. And my suggestion about it, about this adventure, is that we all already know how this story plays out. That's why we like watching movies like that and reading books like that and hearing myths like that. We enjoy that, but why do we enjoy that? Why would we enjoy it? Strange that we enjoy it. How do we know that we want to watch something like that? It may seem like a strange question, but to me it's a good one. How do we know that we want to watch something like that? How do we know that we like it? To me, the reason is that to some extent, in some way, those stories are approximating the adventure that we all really want to go on. The internal adventure that all of us yearn for. We want to go on that adventure. We want to take risks. We want it to be sometimes easy and even to the point of being boring, sometimes terrifying, even to the point of feeling like we're risking our lives. Sometimes I feel like it's so boring I can't do it. Sometimes it's so hard I can't do it. And it goes back and forth, and it's a gradual, indecipherable, ineffable accumulation of knowledge until finally we come to see what is not accumulated, what we didn't acquire through the journey ourselves, whatever that is. And in finding that and coming into our own, finding our place, our purpose, we complete the journey. It's interesting, again, some of you were here when Josh was talking about being an engineer and comparing it to practicing spirituality. And there are two things he said about it. He said he likes being an engineer because it's very tangible, and because you work on a project and then you finish it and you're done with it. So this is very interesting because on the first side, as I said previously, as tangible as physical objects are, they're not as tangible as the spiritual path. If you take what's imaginary, If you consider what you imagine, the subjective internal world, and take a step on a certain spectrum to the objective physical world, and then you take another step in that same direction. Yes, so you're going from what's imaginary to what people refer to as real. If you take another step in that same direction, that's spirituality. That's the spiritual world. It's plain, ordinary, very tangible. But we don't know how to get there. We don't know how to take another step in that direction. So instead of that, we just take a step back and we imagine what it would be like for something to be more real than what we think of as real. And we're left with that imaginary idea. And we start to think that that's what spirituality is. Spirituality is imaginary. God is imaginary. And no one really can tell us otherwise, because for most people, God is imaginary. God is just this concept, some idea. And even people who have met God in certain ways have still only met the conditional kind of God, not the unconditional, the fully tangible kind of God, whatever that is. It certainly isn't any of the things that we attribute to God, because all of those things are imaginary. While that's very interesting, what's also interesting, what's at least equally interesting, is that, as he said, you deal with a problem and then you're done with it. But if any of you have ever owned any of the sorts of things that Josh has made, you're never done with it. It's always breaking. There's always another problem that has to be fixed. And just because he doesn't have to deal with it because he sells it, doesn't mean that no one has to deal with it. On the contrary, we have to deal with it, and we deal with it all the time, and customer service has to deal with it, although they don't. This path is something that you can work with a problem and actually be done with it. You can resolve it. Now, how is that possible? How could you actually resolve it? You actually resolve it because the answer, the solution, the resolution, isn't something that you create. It's as simple as that. It's as simple as that. If you create the solution, that solution will fall apart. If you come up with the answer, that answer will be proven wrong. You can be a brilliant engineer, and you can make a machine that works really well, but soon enough it will stop working. For whatever reason, it will just stop working. It's impermanent in a number of different ways. But what about not having that machine? Can that break? So if you have a machine, it will break. This bell here will break. Here's a bell. It will break at some point. It's like the cup is already broken. So this bell someday will break. It's its nature. But what about not bell? That doesn't break. In the same way, you come up with all kinds of philosophical answers to all kinds of philosophical questions. Those answers will soon enough be shown to be wrong, incomplete, inconsistent, whatever they are, whatever the problem with them may be. Soon enough that will be shown. But what about discarding all of that? What about letting all that go? What about returning to what's natural, to what isn't created? That doesn't break, which means that you can actually be done with it. So, if we think about something like anger, we become very angry, we become hateful. There's a deep fury within us, which I mentioned in my own case. We can try to resolve that by reframing it in this way and understanding it in that way. We can try to come up with a method to get rid of it when it arises. But none of that fully resolves the problem. The problem will come up again. To no longer support the problem, to no longer do what is needed to be done to bring forth the problem, that resolves it fully. Because that solution isn't created. That solution isn't formulated. The way that we come to that point, the way we arrive there, however, isn't by trying to get rid of things, because in a strange way, even getting rid of things is still creating things. You're still creating the state of something not being present. So even that doesn't work. That's why we have techniques. That's why we have these manifold techniques, so that we have something to do in order to no longer favor existence or non-existence. We're thinking about non-self. There is a particular text that emphasizes non-self, the Buddhist view of non-self, more than probably any other, and that is the Diamond Sutra. And I have a portion of it here, an interesting passage that's repeated quite a bit throughout. I'll read the whole thing and let you work with some of it, and I'll only comment on one part of it. If someone were to say, this is the Buddha talking to one of his disciples, whose name is Subhuti. The Buddha asked Venerable Subhuti, if someone were to say that the Buddha preaches the view of a self, the view of a living being, the view of a soul, the view of a person, would that be the right thing? Would that be true? And Subhuti said, no. Why? Because any view of self is viewless. Any view of a self that you have taught as something that is without a view. Now, this sense of non-self, this view called non-self, is in fact simply a lack of a view about self. Maybe some of you know about the vast quantity of opinion, of views on this topic. I was looking up something earlier for these talks and came upon the incredible garbage pile of views on the viewlessness of the view of non-self online. It's incredible how many people feel strongly about this topic and have written about it and have come to very complicated conclusions after a lot of thinking. And looking at all of that, I felt two things. One, I felt sorry for those people for working so hard and getting nowhere. And I felt proud of you for taking the appropriate route, which is the realization of something rather than opining, rather than thinking about things. Why is it that, given that we have such a clear statement here, that we come to the realization of having set aside all views about ourselves, all views about self, all those views we set aside, we lose track of? It's made very clear here that the Buddha doesn't teach a view of self, and in fact any view of self that he teaches is taught as viewless, as without being a view. So there it is, it's straightforward. Why do people get so excited about it? And the reason is that we are afraid. And when people get afraid, we get motivated. It's sad, but true that fear is an unusually powerful motivator for us. We here are trying to get to the point when compassion is a greater motivator than fear. Wouldn't that be nice if we could come to that place? Even if one person could, but if the whole community could, it would be extraordinary. That's leadership in the world today. A community of people who are more motivated by compassion than fear would be incredible. But for most of us, we're more motivated by fear than compassion. And so when someone starts teaching about non-self, we get afraid. And someone actually asked the Buddha about this at one point. They said, is it possible that someone would hear your teaching and become afraid? And the Buddha said, oh yes, certainly, that could happen. He said, okay, well then when would that happen? How could that happen? And the Buddha said, if someone heard these teachings and interpreted them as follows, if I practice this, then myself will be destroyed. If I practice this, then what the practice will do is destroy myself. What my goal in practicing is to destroy myself. I want to get rid of myself. I want to obliterate myself, annihilate myself. That's what meditation is. I'm going to sit down and get rid of myself. Once I've gotten rid of myself, then that's enlightenment. If someone thinks that way, then they'll naturally become afraid. Of course they will become afraid. And then the monk asked the Buddha, is there a case in which someone wouldn't become afraid? And the Buddha said, oh yes, certainly there is. He said, what is that case, Your Holiness? And he said, that would be the case in which someone heard these teachings and didn't think, if I practice this, then myself will be destroyed. If they don't think, by practicing this, I will annihilate and obliterate and get rid of myself. When we hear this teaching, though, that we don't have a view of self, we get very afraid. So we think, I'm going to be destroyed. This meditation practice, this ethical practice, this community is going to destroy me. It will get rid of me, annihilate me. And naturally we become afraid. But that certainly isn't what happens. It's not what happens at all. On the contrary, let's say we're sitting and we have issues around something like anger, as I mentioned in my own case. As we're sitting, that sense, I'm angry, comes up. It comes up. I'm angry. I'm really angry. And that's the basis of self. I then have an identity, which is, I am a person who is angry. We have that identity. We get afraid, perhaps, of that identity. I don't want to be someone who is like that. But we're equally afraid of destroying that identity, getting rid of that identity, because that means destroying myself. And so we feel that we're in a bind. Because we're in a bind, we may panic, which in all likelihood will bring forth that very same pattern at an even deeper level. And so we're stuck. And here we are caught in a positive feedback loop, a bad positive feedback loop between being angry and being afraid. And that sense of anger means we should destroy ourselves, but then we're afraid. Since we're afraid, we feel like we have to protect ourselves, so we become angry. On and on and on. It's terrifying, and it's scary, and it's unproductive. And this path actually offers us a way out of that cycle. How is it done? Is it done by sitting down and deciding, okay, this me who's angry has to be obliterated. I'll now use my breathing to destroy that person? Not at all. On the contrary, we sit down, and when that comes up, we see it just as it is. I'm angry. We see it exactly as it is. We accept it exactly as it is. And we no longer attribute to it so many things. What are the things we might attribute to it? You're bad. Well, we don't attribute that to it. You're never going to go away. We don't attribute that to it. You're good. We don't attribute that to it. You'll be gone in just a moment. We don't attribute that to it. We just have that direct experience until at some point we can see what it is. And this is how this teaching works. We are not trying to destroy something. We're trying to know something for what it is. And this point is very hard to understand. I know that this is very hard to understand, what I'm about to say, but who knows? You all seem very intelligent, so you might get it. It happens sometimes that when we see something clearly, it turns out that the thing we thought it was isn't found. In other words, sometimes when you see something for what it isn't what you thought it was. Now I know, that's tough. It's possible that none of you got it. It often takes years to get that. It's hard to understand that. But it happens. Sometimes you think a person's a certain way, and so you're mad at them. And then later you get to know them and you realize, oh, they're not that way. And I know what I just said, very hard to understand. I know. Hard for me to understand. But it's possible, isn't it? That you could get to know someone and discover that they're not the person you thought they were. It's possible, isn't it? Okay, I can see. None of you are even nodding your heads. I know. Okay. It's okay. You don't have to force yourself here. In the same way, it's possible that you could see a book, not like the picture on the cover, think it's a terrible book, hate that book. And then, for some reason, maybe you're stuck somewhere, it's the only book you have, you read it, turns out you like it. That's possible. Just consider, it could happen. Well, in the same way, you could have the experience, I'm angry, and see that more clearly, and realize that that just isn't what's happening. It's not. So any of you who understood the metaphors I just gave won't have any trouble with this one, right? No problem. Of course, you could meet someone, not like them, then get to know them and like them. You could see a book, not like it, read it, and like it. You could think I'm angry, have the experience of that, and realize I'm not. That's possible, isn't it? Now, the reason I'm saying it takes years to understand is that there's a moment when you get to test if you understand. That is in the moment of being angry, the moment of being afraid, in the moment of being sad, in the moment of being clingy, the moment of being stuck. In that moment, can we acknowledge, this may not be happening. The thing that I'm interpreting, that I'm perceiving, may be an illusion. So how would it work in this particular case? In this particular case, we directly observe, I'm angry. And we ask, what is actually happening here? This is an observation practice. We're carefully observing the experience of being angry. As we observe that practice, as we observe that experience, as we observe that process, we notice that the thing that I was referring to as I'm angry is oftentimes a mixture of other experiences, none of which are I'm angry. One of them may be certain body sensations. Energetic, tight, fiery body sensations may be arising. And we can directly observe that. Oh, interesting. Energetic, tight body sensations are arising. That's something that I can feel with my body right now. I don't even have to be thinking all of these thoughts about I can feel it with my body right now. I can just feel it with my body right now. Yes. Now, those sensations may be angry sensations. You could say those sensations are what constitute anger. But as we observe those sensations, we realize that there doesn't need to be someone experiencing them. That person who's experiencing them isn't found. They're just the sensations happening. Now, there may also be a thought. Maybe a thought of anger. Maybe it's something that we see. We see ourselves doing something angry. And yet when we look at that, we realize that is an image. It's an image. There's a body sensation that I'm feeling, and there's an image that I'm seeing. And in neither of those things am I found. It's an image, and it's a feeling. The feeling is felt, the image is seen. And that's all that's happening. And even the sense I'm seeing it isn't needed. That's attributed to the experience. It's added on to the experience, but isn't actually necessary. And that person isn't apprehended. That person isn't found. There's just the feeling and the seeing. And then we realize, oh, the universe just brings forth change of all kinds all the time. Things are always in flux. They just come and go. And images like this come and go. They're sensory experiences that just come and go. Feelings like this come and go. They're feelings that come and go. That's all. That's what's happening. At no point in that process was I destroyed. There was no point at which something destroyed me. Any more than you could say that by reading the bad book and discovering it's a good book, you couldn't say that you destroyed the bad book. It was never destroyed. The bad book was never, you didn't have to burn the bad book. In fact, you couldn't burn the bad book, could you? Because you couldn't find it. You looked for it, didn't you? You looked through all of the pages for the bad book. At the end of it, you were left without any bad book. You look around the whole room and there's not a bad book in it. So you couldn't burn it if you tried. In the same way, you couldn't destroy yourself if you tried. You could try to destroy yourself. You could try, but you couldn't succeed. Because in order to destroy yourself, you have to find yourself. But the closer you look, the more closely you read those pages, the less you find. This experience of directly observing is an adventure, because again and again we'll come up against something that we are absolutely certain is true. But that is the thing to investigate. We investigate it more and more carefully. We have a certain experience with a certain view, and so we explore that directly. That's what observation is all about. We more and more clearly understand what it is because we experience it for what it is. We notice again and again how we're adding on assumptions to what's happening. We're attributing characteristics to it. We're dragging in our past views. We're adding on our future expectations. But at a certain point, we notice, nonetheless, right now, at this time, this is what's happening. Whatever else there may be, this is what's happening. And we can directly experience it, directly experience it, directly experience it. And without trying to destroy anything, without turning anything into our enemy, we discover freedom. And this is the great gift that we have for the world, that we have a way of resolving problems without fighting against anyone. Without fighting against anyone. Who is this anyone? This anyone is whatever sensory experiences come up for us as we sit. Each of those experiences you could call a someone. It's the me of this moment. That's the someone who's arising. This experience right now. It turns out we don't have to fight against, destroy, obliterate any of it. On the contrary, we fully see it and fully love it in one moment. In this way, the problem is resolved without conflict. And this is our offering to the world. This is our offering to the world. How do we resolve problems without engaging in conflict? How is it possible? There was a famous murderer at the time of the Buddha named Angulimala. Perhaps I'll tell you a bit more about him sometime. But today, let it suffice to describe the simple point that he killed many people, and the Buddha went to see him to try to help him to stop killing people. And people told the Buddha, don't go and see that man, he'll kill you. And the Buddha just nodded in appreciation for their attempt to help him. And then he continued on his way. And when he saw Angulimala, they had a brief conversation. Very brief, just a few lines. And after a few lines, Angulimala suddenly realized that the Buddha had come to see him because he believed in him. He hadn't given up on him. In that moment, the Buddha could truly see and truly love a person who everyone agreed was an evil man. And he threw away his weapons. And he became a monk, and he was harmless for the rest of his life. But this, as you know, there weren't cell phones and such at the time. And so the king hadn't heard about it. It was the king's job to uphold justice in the kingdom, and so he took a legion of his best soldiers to kill Angulimala. And before going to kill Angulimala, the king, Pasenadi, went to the Buddha to ask for his blessing for their safety. Not asking the Buddha to bless their killing of someone, because that would be strange, but he asked him to please bless them for their own safety, which is a reasonable thing to ask, that everyone be safe. But it was still his intention to kill Angulimala. And so he bowed down to the Buddha, and the Buddha asked him, although it seems that the Buddha already knew, he asked him, "Where are you going with this legion of troops? Has a neighboring kingdom attacked you? Has there been a rebellion in the borderlands?" The king said, "Oh, no. No, we're just going out to apprehend and murder that murderer, Angulimala." And the Buddha said, "Oh, yes. Well, let me ask you a question about that. If Angulimala had completely converted, had become harmless and caring, abiding by the precepts, and had become a monk in this very congregation, a disciple of mine, committed to compassion, what would you do then?" And the king said, "Well, of course that's impossible." He said, "Let's set that aside for a moment. We'll just for a moment set aside whether that's impossible. And what would you do if that happened, just hypothetically?" The king said, "Well, it would be incredible. I would be amazed. I would have to bow down to him. I would be inspired by that. In fact, I would take care of him, offer him food and clothing, be sure that he had all the requisites that a monk needs in order to be healthy." And the Buddha said, "Ah, yes. Well, in that case, great king, your majesty, that is Angulimala." And everyone, the whole legion of troops, jumped back, took out their swords. The king went running away and looked. And the Buddha again indicated, that monk right there, that is Angulimala. And the king couldn't believe it. He went over and he had to ask him, "Are you really Angulimala?" And he said, "Yes, I am." And then he said what he would do. So he looked at the Buddha and he said, "Shouldn't lie to a Buddha." So he said, "Do you need any clothes or food or anything?" And he said, "No, I have what I need." He said, "Oh, okay." And then the king said one of the most beautiful lines, I think, in all of world history. He went to the Buddha and bowed down and said, "You, Your Holiness, have done without weapons what I could not do with weapons." This is our offering to the world. Not only in terms of responsibility, not only in terms of how we interact with our society, but also within how we interact with our own direct experience. So please use this observation method so that without any violence, without any conflict, we have a way of resolving the real problems of our lives.